Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. I noticed on LinkedIn that a classmate of mine, a former classmate of mine from business school, has a new title as part of his job, organizing a venture fund in hydrogen fuels. And so I thought it would be interesting to check in with Girish Nadkarni, who is one of the brightest men you'll ever meet, and actually pretty politically astute as well. I've had a great number of good political discussions with him, and find out what's going on with alternative energy. Girish, how are you?
Good. Good to hear from you.
Great to hear from you. And you're obviously joining us from Paris, France.
I am. That's what I am. My primary role is head of Total Carbon Neutrality Ventures, which is the corporate venture arm of Total, and we invest in all kinds of technologies and business models which contribute to carbon neutrality.
Okay, so tell me sort of the gamut of carbon neutrality ventures that you're involved in.
Okay, so as you know, the usual ones like renewables, smart energy, a lot in the electricity side, because one of the ways to reduce reliance on fossil fuels is to electrify things. And then there are all kinds of issues around the grid in terms of distributed, energy management, etc. We are also investing in biofuels. We are investing in what is known as gas to protein, where you take CO2, gas to protein.
Okay.
Actually, there is a larger group called gas to value, whereas part of that is gas to protein. So you can actually create single cell proteins from carbon dioxide. You feed in carbon dioxide, and you can use it to make fish feed and other things. You could also potentially make human feed from that. So that's one way of capturing the carbon dioxide. We are also investing actively in the energy storage and battery space. We own a company called SAFT, which is the largest battery manufacturer in Europe. And batteries are critical both for electric cars as well as for grid scale storage. And the other couple of interesting areas we're focusing on is, although it's sort of somewhat related to climate change, but also stand on its own, is the whole area of circular economy, bioplastics, recycling, etc. And finally, the whole emerging area of carbon offsets.
Fascinating. And so this is all what ways of the firm getting green, or position itself as green, or do you think this is actually the future?
Well, it's a combination of things. So first and foremost, we issued we have always thought of ourselves over the years as not necessarily an oil and gas company, but as a diversified or a broad energy company. And in fact, last week, we issued a press release saying we're going to ask our shareholders to allow us to change our name from Total to Total Energies, one word, capital T, capital E. So we are big in not just oil and gas, but renewables, in wind, in solar, in natural gas, etc. There is another part, and as part of that, we have also declared, like many companies and many countries, that by a certain date, say 2030 or whatever, we are going to go carbon neutral. And as you might know, there are 3 different levels of your carbon responsibility: scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3, where scope 1 is the carbon emitted from the energy that is supplied to you. Scope 2 is what you generate yourself in your operations. And scope 3 is what your customers emit. And of course, it's a lot easier for you to control scope 2 and potentially scope 1, and a lot more difficult to manage scope 3. But when you declare yourself to become carbon neutral by a certain date, it doesn't mean that you will generate no carbon at all, because that will be next to impossible unless everything works on hydrogen or whatever. So one way of addressing that is just to do what basically companies and countries do, is to say, okay, I'm going to reduce my carbon footprint as much as I can. And to the extent that I generate some carbon, I'm going to offset it by some activities which are negative carbon, which extract carbon from the ecosystem, or which sequester carbon, etc. So on a net basis, my footprint is 0.
So this is what, planting trees or something?
Planting trees is one of them. Reforestation, afforestation. There is a whole new, there's carbon capture. and either storage or reuse. So there are people doing what is called direct air capture. You just extract carbon from the air, or you do what is called point source, where carbon is generated as part of an industrial process, whether it's steel or cement or paper or plastics, and you capture that and you find a way to either mineralize it or store it or reuse it, things like that. And there is a whole area now emerging around, and because companies are now focusing a lot on negative carbon or carbon offsets, what we don't have today is a robust, reliable, and credible way of evaluating how much carbon you have actually saved. So, how do you measure it? How do you make sure it's credible? How do you make sure the same carbon credit isn't sold 2 times? How do you create a liquidity in the marketplace? So there's a whole bunch of companies emerging in this carbon offset space, from tracking to measuring, etc. And that's also another area where we are investing in.
And just recently, you've announced this hydrogen fund. Tell me about hydrogen and what your interest is in hydrogen.
Right. So even though electric cars are significantly carbon neutral, not I should say carbon neutral, but much lower carbon footprint than the traditional combustion engine, but nonetheless, you do have some level of carbon, whether it's in terms of manufacturing, or if you look at it just on the power, right? So you can have an EV, but if you charge your battery from electricity, which is generated by coal-powered plants, you really haven't achieved much, because it's still emitting coal,
right?
Or from oil-powered plants or whatever. Even gas-powered plants, even though it's much lower footprint than coal, it still has a footprint. Now, hydrogen is the only fuel which is completely carbon neutral, because the only output is water. So hydrogen, and so what we're trying to do here is to say, look, there is, we've talked of hydrogen for a very long time.
Yeah, I think about 20 years ago or so, I read a book called
exactly.
Hydrogen Economy.
Exactly. So the key in the world of energy is not the lack of technology. There is a lot of technology to do a lot of things. The key is to make the technology commercially viable and affordable. And in the short to medium term, you do that by you're all familiar with the learning cycle or the production cycle, or getting scale, and therefore the prices fall down. But for you to be able to make it commercially viable, in order to get the economies of scale and the learning curve, you have to be able to sell it commercially. And so we have seen this in renewables, where the government step up and offer some kind of subsidies, loans, contract for difference, feed-in tariff, whatever the format it takes. So it says, okay, if the commercial viable price is $10, but your cost of production is 15, the government steps in and says, okay, we'll give you a subsidy for 5 or 4 or 3 or whatever to make it more commercially viable. And over time, the volume reaches, and solar is a perfect example, where today solar can survive without any subsidies,
right.
etc. So now hydrogen was technically possible. The question became the cost, and there are different ways of creating hydrogen. There is something called gray hydrogen, there is blue hydrogen, and there is green hydrogen, depending upon what the source is and how much carbon is actually emitted. So in certain projects, you can actually create carbon, but there is a CO2 footprint from that. And then you therefore need to be able to capture that carbon and store it or reuse it or whatever. And sometimes you can use it for what is known as enhanced oil recovery, where you put it back into the ground to create, But the best carbon is hydrogen is green hydrogen, where you use the green energy, and then you use electrolyzers, so essentially split water into hydrogen and oxygen. And then you capture that hydrogen. And so it has zero or close to zero carbon footprint. And then you can use it for multiple purposes. And by the way, that is called power to gas. When you convert or create hydrogen from electricity. It's called power to gas. So we will be funding power to gas projects. But mobility is the holy grail. Okay.
To get the hydrogen in
And
cars.
exactly. Hydrogen
We're gonna take a break for some
Sure.
messages and come back more with Girish and understand exactly how you could actually put hydrogen into a car to fuel it. Stay with us.
Sure.
Welcome back to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour, Saga 960. I'm having a chat tonight with a former classmate of mine from business school, Girish Nadkarni, who is working in Paris, France for a oil and gas company that's really sounds like it's doing quite a bit in renewable energy. And the one that intrigued me the most was an announcement that came out on LinkedIn just a little while ago about a hydrogen venture fund. And I've been a follower of hydrogen and ammonia and other renewable energy opportunities for a while. And so I thought it'd be great to check in with Girish. Girish, you got a great view of the Eiffel Tower in behind you. Is that your real view? Do you have the Eiffel Tower right out of your window?
I see the Eiffel Tower from my balcony, yes, but that's not the one you're seeing. But I can see it from my window, yes.
And how long have you been living in Paris?
About 3.5 years now.
Fantastic. And your family's still in Connecticut?
Well, my wife was with me initially, but then we had some grandchildren. And then with the COVID situation, since my daughter was working from home, she needed some help taking care of a 3.5-year-old terrorist and a 6-month-old baby. So she and the other grandmother are chipping in to help her while and because of the COVID, you can't really go out and
can't travel back and forth.
Yeah, exactly.
And how are you enjoying Paris? Lots of nice dinners?
Well, right now everything is closed.
Oh, really? That's too bad.
So the only thing you can do at the moment, we actually have a curfew at 6 p.m. So you can do takeouts, but of course the fancy restaurants are not doing takeouts. The one thing it has forced me to do is learn to cook. So I've become a reasonably decent cook. So,
well, when things open up, I'm coming to visit you, buddy.
Anytime.
I love
nice
Paris.
apartment. So yeah.
So we were talking about hydrogen, and maybe we could just take a step back and you can explain to everybody why when you burn hydrogen, you're not emitting any carbon dioxide.
Well, it's pure hydrogen. So there is no carbon element in there. There is no carbon.
And so when you're burning oil and gas, you're burning what?
So when you're burning gas or methane, gas is methane, it's CH4. So there is the C in there. Oil is, as we know, a hydrocarbon. So carbon is in there. And when you do batteries for your EVs, it depends upon how the batteries are manufactured, but more importantly, how you charge your batteries. So if you charge your batteries using your energy and your electricity comes from gas-powered plants, power plants, then you're actually using coal. And as a result of which, it's not as eco-friendly as you may think it is. Whereas hydrogen is just hydrogen. It's H2. There is no carbon in there. So it is the purest form of no carbon, not even low carbon, but no carbon energy.
Right. And I think the interesting thing, and you're the experienced gentleman in this area, not I, but is that when you think about what you're talking about with hydrogen versus, oil and gas, you're getting the energy out of oil and gas, but you're really shipping this carbon halfway around the world, and it doesn't create the energy. It just sort of gets emitted as a pollution byproduct of the process. And so by using something like hydrogen, you're far more efficient because you're shipping just the energy and you're using that hydrogen to create the energy.
Yeah. So, today we are looking at trucks and cars and even potentially airplanes using hydrogen. Now, in energy, there are a few things which we need to be aware of. One is what is called the energy density, which is in 1 kilogram or 1 liter of any energy substance, whether it's kerosene or petrol, how much energy is in there, okay? So today, petroleum or kerosene has the largest energy density, okay? The reason you don't have airplanes today using, or large airplanes, long distance airplanes, there are now smaller airplanes for short distance using batteries, is because the energy density of lithium is much, much, much lower, which means you need a much larger box to generate the same level of energy. Okay. And as a result of which, and hydrogen is much higher than lithium. So it's not as high as kerosene, but it's, its volume density is much better. The other thing is why you can't have a pure battery aircraft and you need some level of kerosene is at the point of takeoff, the amount of thrust you need is not something which can be supplied by a battery today.
Right.
You have to have some form of kerosene or aircraft fuel
to get you going. Now, I understand that some of the challenges with hydrogen is that it needs to be kept under intense pressure or super chilled. Is that correct?
Well, it goes back to the notion of energy density. Okay, first of all, it's very interesting. Most people don't know that, but hydrogen doesn't exist in nature. There is no natural hydrogen out there. You have to it's always part of something else, water, H2O, or something else. So you have to actually create hydrogen. Okay. The other thing is hydrogen is an extremely light substance. So for example, if you want to, and the molecules are extremely small. So today you cannot really use our natural gas pipelines to push hydrogen through it because it's not built for hydrogen molecules. Hydrogen molecules will start escaping. They're way too small compared to methane molecules. So you can mix it with hydrogen, methane and hydrogen or natural gas and hydrogen, and then do it, but you can't just push it through. So the reason you chill it or the reason you freeze it or whatever is to reduce the density of it so that you can, otherwise you will not be able to carry or transport huge amounts of it. So that's one way of bringing down the volume.
Okay, so that's interesting. I didn't understand that. So naturally, it's not in a natural state. You wouldn't need to compress it. It's to achieve this higher density that you need to
Exactly.
fill it or to put it under pressure.
Exactly. Yeah.
Because when I understand people have been trying to put it into cars and things like that, the size of either the chiller or the strength of the high pressure tank is such that it makes it uneconomic.
Yeah.
How have you tried to address those problems?
So right now the best use is because of the volume density issue. There are cars today built by Toyota, Nissan, etc. But it'd be better today for mid-size to large trucks and for trains because the size is not a problem there. It's a lot easier to put a larger hydrogen tank on a truck than it is to put it in a car.
Right.
But over time, the technology will improve. We'll find better ways of compressing it. We'll find cheaper ways of doing that. And trains, certainly you can do that. Airplanes becomes a challenge again beyond a certain size, because obviously the bigger you make the tanks, the heavier the plane becomes, and you kind of get into sort of an infinite loop challenge about that.
So you say that you have been, your company has been a primarily petroleum-based, oil and gas-based company, but you're trying to reposition as an energy company. What's your strategy? Would you make 100% purchases of hydrogen companies or other alternative energy companies, or minority investments, or how are you going to go about doing this, do you think?
Well, we have a pretty significant presence today in in solar and in wind already. So today we are one of the leading developers and energy producers in solar and in wind. And we have done that either through greenfield projects, or we have bought projects, or we have bought companies. So a combination thereof. And we have declared that by 2030, we will be at 35 gigawatts, et cetera. So we are very, very serious. And, last week we announced a huge purchase of offshore project in the UK, along jointly with BP and a couple of other players.
Offshore what? Offshore wind?
Offshore wind, yes.
Okay, now come on, we got to take a step back here and talk about Texas. All these Republicans in Texas have been complaining about wind, saying that in the deep freeze, the wind didn't work, and it froze up, and that's the problem. That's what caused all the grid problems. We have wind in Canada. We don't have those problems. There's wind offshore in the English Channel. They don't seem to have those problems. What's the story here?
Okay, so that I think was a sort of a cheap shot right off the bat. and Governor Abbott had to walk that back because wind provides no more than 10, maybe 13% of Texas's energy. So even assuming for a moment that all wind turbines froze, that's only 10% of your energy. What happened to the other 90%? Okay. The answer is, and of course, we'll still find that out, but the answer very simply is, A, they were not prepared for the cold in terms of the plants and in terms of the pipelines, etc. Because historically, their high peak has always been the summer, whereas winter has been much lower in terms of energy demand. And so they were just completely caught off guard. They had not winterized their, it appears, had not winterized their plants and their pipelines, etc., which froze. And in order to avoid being regulated by FERC, which is the federal authority, they cut themselves off from the rest of the country in terms of their grid. Whereas other parts of the US, you can buy or sell electricity to people within your region or within the country. There are all kinds of mechanisms for doing that, but that means then you allow competition from outside, and then you're federally regulated. So as we all know, the Republicans hate the federal government so much, but they keep running for office to become federal presidents or senators, which never surprises me. If you hate the federal government so much, why do you want to be Secretary of Treasury or the president? But that's a different discussion. But basically, this is something they have brought, this is the chickens coming home to roost.
But bottom line, wind power stations can work, wind turbines can work in cold, freezing weather. They do in Canada. You just have to winterize it, correct?
Of course. I mean, they work in Denmark, they work in the North Sea, they work in all parts of the world.
And I heard an interview with the mayor of El Paso, and he was saying that all they did is they winterized their switching units, and the rest of Texas didn't, and that was part of the problem. They just didn't anticipate cold weather and didn't winterize.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay. So we've dismissed that issue. Okay. So you've invested in wind and you've invested in solar. Has that been through venture investments, or has that been greenfield 100% owned investment?
Okay. So today, solar and wind is a pretty mature industry. So we don't need to do venture investments. So there are always opportunities. For example, we were looking at an investment in a company which is doing floating solar, right? Because one of the things you're finding is as solar is spreading, the land where you can actually use it is increasingly becoming more and more used up. So they're looking for new areas to put in solar. And so lakes and ponds and oceans are now starting to be the next point of thing. And so we were looking at to invest in a company which did that. So that would be something we could do, or a new type of turbine work. But nonetheless, it's a mature industry, and that's not where we are necessarily focusing today. Having said that, we do have, for example, a company called Solstice, which is doing community solar. So we are investing in areas which are doing business models. So they are creating, marketing and other things for community solar projects, where societies or villages or towns or little neighborhoods come together to create their, on a microgrid basis. We have another company called Level 10, which allows for sort of creation of purchase power agreements between corporates and solar providers and developers, so that it sort of streamlines the process and makes it more efficient. So these are areas where we as venture are investing, but our solar and wind businesses are out there buying or setting up.
It's interesting that you describe wind and solar as mature industries when, the governor in Texas and a whole bunch of, other people talk about the Green New Deal and things like that as being, cutting edge and too innovative and scary and way too expensive and things like that.
Well, there are parts of the world where they may need some subsidies. Now let's recognize that there are a few things you need. One is the ability for you to produce the equipment for it. Unfortunately, a large part of that today is in China. Though wind, clearly you have champions in Europe from Vestas to GE and Siemens and other people. But the solar panels today industry is mostly Chinese, as we all know. One of the challenges in the US is the ability to transmit electricity across the country, because you have lots of areas where you don't have right of way. And that's a big barrier to do that. So you could theoretically put up huge wind farms or huge solar farms, say in Texas, and then send that electricity all over the country. But today, it's very difficult to do that because lots of these transmission lines get stuck in litigation and fights, and farmers and landowners and ranchers don't want those lines, crossing their territory, or they want to be paid, etc. So to be honest, I have not studied what the subsidies and the costs are in the clean air, in the green bill. So I will be able to tell you, is this thing justified not, or whether it can be paid back or not.
We're chatting with Girish Nadkarni about alternative energy and primarily hydrogen. We're going to take a break for some messages and come back more with Girish in just a minute. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour, Saga 960. We're chatting tonight about alternative energy with Girish Nadkarni, who is a former classmate of mine, and an incredibly smart guy. Girish, we were talking about solar, we were talking about wind. You were saying they were effectively mature industries. The cost of some of those have come down fairly dramatically. We talked about your investments, your interest in hydrogen, and I mentioned that I read a book 20 years ago or so about the hydrogen economy and was quite intrigued. And it really hasn't sort of come. There's a couple of companies in Canada, Ballard as one of them, for example, that has focused on hydrogen. One of the interesting things that's come up over and over again is that a bunch of streetcar companies across North America in the 1920s actually ran on ammonia, and ammonia is comparable to hydrogen, I understand. And when you burn ammonia in an internal combustion engine, similarly, all you get is oxygen and water vapors as sort of the effluent from it. So again, there's no carbon in ammonia, and so therefore you don't get any pollution from carbon. And from what I understand, ammonia doesn't need to be kept under pressure or super chilled. So is ammonia also a possibility?
Oh, absolutely. In fact, ammonia is a way to store hydrogen. If you don't want to super chill it, or if you want to do other compress it, ammonia is a way to store hydrogen. So you can convert hydrogen to ammonia and then you extract it back. But you can use ammonia directly for fuel. There are now ships being built, or in fact, there may be some ships today which are actually running on ammonia. Now, there may be some safety issues there in terms of potential explosiveness, etc., which possible. But yes, ammonia is definitely increasingly being looked at as a potential viable fuel.
So one of the things that you had mentioned is that you can't ship nitrogen through a natural gas pipeline.
Hydrogen, yeah.
Hydrogen, you're right. And I understand that ammonia you can. And so, we've got these pipelines in Canada that are big issues because of concerns as they cross the Rockies and cross to the Pacific Ocean. People worry about leaks into the water or into the air or whatnot. And some people are recommending actually what we should do is at source, convert the petroleum into ammonia and ship the ammonia through the pipeline, which you can do. And then if you've got a leak, it's no issue. Does that make any sense?
Unfortunately, I don't know enough from a technical perspective what the implications are, what the corrosive issues are, what the potential for flammability is, etc. It's possible, but you may need to do some adjustment to that.
Yeah, all should be looked at. So ammonia and hydrogen have real possibilities. As you mentioned, they're an energy currency, and so therefore, when you think about your wind. Your windmill, your wind power, or your solar, rather than shipping energy through electricity on power lines, you could actually, as you mentioned, turn it into either ammonia or hydrogen at source, and you wouldn't have this problem that people talk about of the windmills stop working when you don't have any wind, or the solar plants stop working when you don't have any sun, because you can actually store that hydrogen and ammonia. Is that not correct?
True. The challenge will come down to not just creating ammonia or storing it, but also transporting it. So I couldn't tell you today what the challenges or cost of transporting it are. But you're right. If it is similar to natural gas, then it should be doable. But the fact that it is not a standard today suggests that there may be some initial challenges.
Right. Well, ammonia is shipped all across Canada because farmers use it as fertilizer. And so
Of course. But that's in a different form. Yeah, you're right.
Almost every farmer's field has a big white tank that stores some ammonia that they're going to put on.
But don't forget, ammonia is also today a highly controlled substance because it's also an input into explosives.
Yeah, but you got to add the nitrate to make it ammonia nitrate before it is explosive. So ammonia on its own is not explosive.
You're right. On its own is not, but it's a feedstock. It's an input.
You got to get the nitrate.
Yes. In fact, I think it was Terry McQuay, or the guy who blew up, the ex-army guy who blew up the thing in Oklahoma City. He had used ammonia as a building stock for his explosives.
Now, how is ammonia and ammonia and hydrogen different? One is NH3 and one is H2?
H2, yes. So as I said before, hydrogen doesn't exist in nature in a natural form. There is no H2 in nature.
Right.
It's always NH3 or it's H2O or something else. And therefore, you have to find a way to say, where does it exist? Now, water being the most common and prevalent thing, though I have to say, I read the other day that in some places, even that is being questioned because of shortage of water in many places. So even electrolysis as a source of creating hydrogen may potentially run into challenges for all things, ironically, because of a shortage of water.
Does it have to be fresh water or could it be seawater?
It could be seawater.
Well, we've got lots of seawater.
Yeah, but then, the question always is, do everything, at the right place at the right time, right?
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I think that you're tapping into a potential huge opportunity because I happen to believe that hydrogen and ammonia, along with solar and wind, are incredible solutions. As people have taken a look, and again, my focus is primarily Canada, a lot of the hydrogen or ammonia solutions can be done at source. So we can take the hydrocarbons and convert them at source to either hydrogen or ammonia.
Absolutely.
And then the issue is carbon sequestration. When you talked about some of the ways that you can actually sequester the carbon right at source and actually use the carbon to help you take out more efficiently the existing hydrocarbons that are in the oil wells or the oil sands or whatever it is. And then you're shipping only a product, hydrogen or ammonia, that doesn't have any carbon in it. And so I think you said stage 1, stage 2, stage 3, the customer is not going to be emitting any carbon.
Correct.
The transfer won't have any carbon in it.
Correct.
And so therefore the producer has the carbon issue and they've got to figure out how to sequester it at source.
Yeah.
But at least you're not shipping the carbon all the way around the world.
Exactly right. So the LCA, the life cycle assessment is going to be much lower, right? And by the way, just you mentioned about the fund we are raising for hydrogen. One of the things I wanted to also mention is the primary area we will be focusing on initially is in the transportation business, okay? So what we saw in the EV market was a two-sided market or a chicken and egg problem. People were not willing to buy EVs because they didn't see enough charging stations. And
EVs are electrical vehicles.
Electric vehicles, yes. And people are not buying enough electric vehicles because they didn't see enough charging stations and they had this concern around range anxiety. And businesses were not installing charging stations because they weren't seeing people buying enough EVs. So you have this chicken and egg problem. So we said, okay, the best way to address that is to fund both sides simultaneously. So as part of our hydrogen fund, which is, we hope, we've already soft circled about 700-800 million euros for it, and we are hoping to raise up to 2 billion. The whole purpose behind the fund is to actually kickstart the hydrogen ecosystem. Lots of players, lots of people in the ecosystem are eager to start, but it's like everybody's waiting for the other to start, waiting for the right subsidies to be in place. But if you can, say, fund a 1,000 truck fleet and at the same time fund the installation of hydrogen refueling stations, then both sides feel comfortable and it makes economic sense. Because if you just fund the fleets but not enough hydrogen refueling stations, then you have a problem, and vice versa. So that's one of the things we hope to do with the fund.
Well, and I think that it's brilliant for your company because unlike solar or wind, which really are replacements for oil and gas, this is a potential use of oil and gas and gives you the challenge of how to deal with the carbon at source and sequester it. But really, it uses your existing oil and gas.
Yeah, to some extent, yes. But though, as I said, for you to have green hydrogen and not, I mean, if you're extracting hydrogen using, steam methane reformation or whatever, then you're using it from the carbon dioxide and other things emitted from, or methane emitted from natural gas. But for you to have green hydrogen, it has to come from electrolyzers. And electrolyzers are powered by green energy. So it is never, green hydrogen should not be part of our oil and gas value chain.
Right, understood. This climate change issue is obviously something that you and your company feel is real and something you need to address. Otherwise, you wouldn't be thinking about going carbon neutral.
Yeah. I would say the European oil and gas companies are particularly focused on this. We created a group called Oil and Gas Climate Initiative about 4 years ago. It was 10 of the largest non-US oil and gas companies like BP, Shell, Repsol, Total, Equinor, etc. It was initially a CEO level organization trying to address greenhouse gases and how do we address that. And then they created $1 billion fund, now up to $1.2 billion, where each of us contributed $100 million each. And the focus of the fund is to invest in technologies and projects which address carbon dioxide, methane, etc., and to invest in areas where there has been market failure. So, for example, we seed the early projects in carbon capture, which a developer today would find too risky. So we seed it, we de-risk it, we take it to the point where it becomes potentially attractive for a developer, and then we turn around and sell it or give it away.
I think that's a brilliant move for you as an industry to follow and to really change what's going on. But Girish, there's still a lot of people, maybe not in Europe, and I'd be interested in your point of view in that, but in North America, primarily the United States, that still don't believe in climate change as an issue, or don't think that it's man-made, or don't think that we should be reducing carbon to the extent that the Paris Accords would suggest, because it's going to destroy our economy. So what I'd like to do? I'd like you to think about that. And we're going to take a break and come back with some concluding comments. And I'm going to ask Girish how he would persuade all of us that this is the issue of our generation, because I happen to believe it is. We're going to be back in just a minute. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Brian Crombie Radio Wire, Saga 960. What a pleasure for me to chat again after, gosh, what is it, Girish, 30 years?
Almost, yeah.
It's a while. With a former classmate of mine, Girish Nadkarni, who is a senior executive with Total, what I thought was an oil and gas petroleum company, but sounds like it's doing a lot of business in alternative energies. And Girish just announced, I think it was a week ago, that he's heading up a venture fund to invest in hydrogen investments. And I thought that was kind of intriguing.
I'm actually helping raise it. I'm not running it. I'm helping raise it.
Helping to raise it. Okay, I apologize. Raise that money and then help invest it. And I think that hydrogen and ammonia and wind and solar happen to be some of the solutions. But Girish, as we were just talking about, a lot of people still don't believe that climate is either real or is man-made, or if we actually address it, we're going to destroy the economy. So therefore, and jobs, particularly in Alberta or Texas. And so therefore, we shouldn't bother focusing on it. What would you say to them?
Okay, so I would say there are those who are clearly worried about their jobs or their industry. I understand that. It's an economic issue. It's an issue addressing their livelihood, etc. Let's put those people aside for a moment. there is a large number of people who just deny climate change. Okay. And this, I would say, is somewhat uniquely an American problem, less so in other parts of the world. And it is tied into a larger political problem, in my view, one of which is just rejection of science, rejection of expertise. It is a sort of caught up in this us versus them, the blue collar versus the white collar, the intelligentsia, etc. And it's whether it's the Trump base. So it's part of that. And there is other part of that, which is to the extent that the liberals believe in something, the quote unquote conservatives will in a knee-jerk way reject it. And you saw that in the world of healthcare, for example, where somebody like Romney actually rejected the healthcare plan he himself had instituted in Massachusetts because now it was being championed by the Democrats. So there's a sort of combination of all of that going on. So from my perspective, the way I would address it is the following. One, just the fact of what's happening in Texas, what's happening in Florida, what's happening in California, etc. At some point, you will have, when the water is coming up to your knees in Florida, or you're shivering in Texas, you're going to have to find out a reason to explain that. Now, it happened once, you can say it's a freak accident, but you can't have 100-year floods every year and still call it a 100-year flood. Okay, that's one issue. The second issue is, I am a strong believer, I'm looking actually at this issue about the whole question of behavioral science, which is how do you convince people or how do you motivate people? There's this theory of nudge and other things. So I'm sort of looking at that as a way to see.
Sorry, the theory of nudge?
Yes, nudge.
Oh,
there's a famous book called Nudge, Nudge, which leverages behavior.
That's a whole nother topic. That sounds fascinating, but let's not talk about it today.
Yeah. And then finally, I think you just have to ignore them. You just have to press on ahead with the right incentives, with the right attitude, with the right technologies, etc. And if you want to be a Luddite, guess what? The world is, the Industrial Revolution went on ahead irrespective of what the Luddites thought. And so the same here. We just have to keep pressing ahead and just make it a reality.
So I interviewed a senior executive at GM Canada, and they said that GM Canada's objective was to be 100% electrical vehicles by 2035.
2035, yes. A lot. BMW has announced that. Volkswagen has announced that, I believe. Jaguar has announced that. So they're kind of seeing the writing on the wall that they have to go there.
My sister used to be the Assistant Deputy Minister of Energy. Sorry, not of energy, of environment in Canada, which would be, sort of deputy secretary in a U.S. equivalent or something like that.
Right.
And she said that the Paris Accords don't go far enough, that the environmental catastrophes that climate change are going to bring are such that we need to get to zero. What do you think about that?
For me, the issue is not whether they go far enough. The issue is how close to it can we even come? Okay. So it doesn't matter where you put the target. The question is, what can you do to get there? What do you have to do to get there? Okay. What kind of mechanisms you have to do there? With people like Bolsonaro and Brazil cutting down the forest, Amazon forest, et cetera. It is going to be a challenge. Now maybe, there's a whole area called nature-based solutions where you're buying Amazon forest in order to get carbon credits, et cetera. But let's see how far that goes. The part I'm also worried about is that we start approaching 1.5 or 2 degree, the thing. And then some people say, oh, okay, we're getting there, so we can pull back.
Sort of like our potential reaction to the pandemic right now.
Exactly. Right.
Open up to it.
So, hey, if we need to have 80% people vaccinated to achieve herd, immunity, once you hit 55, 60, you can say, oh, wait a minute, I don't need to do it because others are doing it. So it again gets back into behavioral science in terms of how people behave, how they react,
the old free rider problem.
The free rider problem, clearly.
Well, Girish, I happen to believe, and lots of other people have said this, but I happen to believe this is the challenge for our generation.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
with people like you raising the money to invest in the solutions, I have confidence that we're going to, if not achieve it, certainly go a long way in achieving it. So thank you so much for the efforts that you and your company are engaged in to try to help our climate change issues. And I think the other thing that you're doing, which I think makes a ton of sense, is you're proving that actually people can make money as we solve this problem, whether it be the people that are coming up with the inventions or the people like you that are going to be investing in those events.
Yeah, agreed. If you make something commercially viable, it acquires a logic of its own, and you don't therefore need to do it in order to, do good. It's what they call the double bottom line, right?
Sounds good. Double bottom line. Yeah. Get paid to do good. Girish Nadkarni, thank you so much, and good luck with your hydrogen fund.
Thank you. Good seeing you again.
That's our show for tonight. The Brian Crombie Radio is on every night, Monday through Friday at 6 o'clock on 960 AM, or you can stream me online at www.saga960am.ca, or you can get all my podcasts and video casts after the fact on Brian Crombie.